In part 1 of this journey back through the history of Star Fox, we took a look at the first game in the series and the sequel that never was. The cancellation of Star Fox 2 so far into development is one of those game cancellations that was hard to accept for fans. By the time Star Fox 2 was cancelled, the Nintendo 64 was well into development, and fans could really only hope the series would live on in the next generation. Luckily it would, and after the Nintendo 64 suffered some delays getting to market, it finally made it to store shelves in late 1996. With the launch lineup for the Nintendo 64 consisting only of 2 games, one of which being the outstanding Super Mario 64, early adopters were craving any new releases as we entered 1997. By mid-97, there were a decent stream of releases since launch, including Wave Race 64 and Mario Kart 64, but there was still a relatively small number of games available for the system. On July 1st, 1997, just over 4 years after Star Fox came out and about 2 years after Star Fox 2 was cancelled, the second official release in the Star Fox series was finally available, known as Star Fox 64.
Message from General Pepper. Priority 1. We need your help, Star Fox. Andros has declared war. He's invaded the Lylat system and is trying to take over Corneria. Our army alone can't do the job. Hurry, Star Fox.
Though many of the core ideas originally intended for Star Fox 2 were implemented in Star Fox 64, it was in fact an entirely different game. One of the biggest differences between what Star Fox 2 would have been and what Star Fox 64 ended up being was that it wasn't a sequel in a story sense. Star Fox 64 is an expanded retelling of the original game, rather than the direct follow-up that Star Fox 2 was set to be. Star Fox 64 presents Andros' attack on the Lylat system as an unexpected turn of events, and certainly not the second time it had happened. The Lylat system itself is also a bit different than it was in the original game, with noticeably more planets and some of the existing planets in different locations. Star Fox 64 also expands upon the characters and backstory, and overall has much more fleshed out narrative elements than the original. The game begins by telling the story of the original Star Fox team, led by Fox's father, and their tragic defeat at the hands of Andros years prior. The game's story isn't spectacular by any means, but compared to other action games of the time, and especially compared to the original game, the story is certainly above average. The characters is still basically the embodiment of specific archetypes, but they have a lot more personality and a bit more nuance than they did in the original, which is largely thanks to the presence of voice acting.
I guess you're good for something!
In addition to giving the members of Star Fox team a distinct voice and personality, the voice acting also allows the game to deliver story and character interactions during gameplay, without splitting the player's attention like the first game did with its text chatter during combat.
The last line has been breached!
These guys are crazy! Dang! Deploy it now!
The original Star Fox was a technical marvel when it was first released, but as we saw in part 1, it aged very quickly as 3D technology continued to rapidly improve in those early years of polygons. If Star Fox 2 had come out when intended, it wouldn't have been nearly as visually impressive as the first game, despite being noticeably more advanced than its predecessor, simply because of the rapidly increasing standards. By opting not to release Star Fox 2 in favor of waiting for the Nintendo 64, Nintendo ensured that Star Fox would again be on the cutting edge. Star Fox 64, at a time before Ocarina of Time, Perfect Dark, or Conker's Bad Fur Day, was among the best looking N64 games available, and holds up better today than many games on the system. It's obviously not at all advanced by today's standards, but economical use of the resources available lends the game a clean look that keeps it from being an eyesore like many N64 games are today.
Let's rock and roll!
It wasn't just technically proficient visuals that set the game apart, but a great presentation as well. We've already covered the voice acting, but the game also had a cinematic quality to it that really made it something special back in 1997. Each of the unique looking levels told its own story, and the little vignettes to open and close each stage added a sense of spectacle. The cartridge-based Nintendo 64 was obviously not capable of the kind of cinematic full-motion CGI cutscenes we would soon see on the CD-based PlayStation with games like Final Fantasy VII later in the year, but Star Fox's in-engine cinematics with sweeping camera angles and faux orchestrated music was still impressive in its own right. Like the original game 4 years prior, Star Fox 64's innovation was almost entirely in the visuals and presentation, with the gameplay and design once again sticking close to what worked already. However, that's not to say the game is a carbon copy of the original, and in fact it improves upon it in many ways. One of the more interesting aspects of the game's design is the way it handles the multiple paths through the game. Having multiple paths through a game was nothing new, having been seen in games such as Castlevania 3 and of course the original Star Fox, but Star Fox 64 implemented this idea in a much more elegant and seamless way. In the original game, you simply chose one of 3 paths through the Lylat system at the beginning of the game, with Path 1 being the easiest and Path 3 being the hardest. Star Fox 64 also uses its 3 paths to represent difficulty, but rather than simply choose your path, you must instead discover how to change course through gameplay. Most players will just naturally take the bottom path on their first playthrough, that being not only the easiest path, but the one that doesn't require any specific actions to take. As you play the game more, you'll uncover secret actions on some levels that reward you with the mission accomplished ending text rather than the standard mission complete text. Some missions require a certain number of enemy kills, some require that certain teammates remain alive, while others still require you to perform specific actions during the stage. You never know what the level requires until you uncover it, giving the game a great sense of discovery. Rather than there being 3 distinct sets of levels through the game, you'll often find yourself jumping back and forth between the bottom, middle, and top paths as you discover the secret objectives to some levels and not others, which creates great replay value for what is, like the original, a game that can be completed in about an hour.
Something's up ahead! Looks different!
All range mode.
It wasn't just the design that saw some smart improvements, but the gameplay as well. Moving up to the Nintendo 64, the game was able to make use of the system's new analog controls, giving the player much greater control in both movement and aiming. 2 of the key features originally intended for Star Fox 2, sequences of 360-degree movement and dogfights against a rival team, were both implemented in Star Fox 64, though these aren't my favorite sequences.
Don't get too cocky, Star Fox.
Let's see how you handle our new ships.
Too bad Dad's not here to see you fail. We'll make sure you never reach Android. We'll just see about that, Star Wolf.
The all-range mode encounters as well as the Star Wolf fights all devolve into simply trying to get behind the enemy and keeping them from getting behind you. These sequences are undoubtedly more accurate to real dogfighting than the linear levels, but I've always considered Star Fox at its best as an arcade shooter rather than a flight sim. Probably the biggest gameplay addition in Star Fox 64 were the 2 new vehicles that were added into the mix. The majority of the game does consist of R-Wing levels, but there were a few opportunities to use the new vehicles, which were a submarine and a tank. The core gameplay with these vehicles is mostly the same, but the new maneuvering capabilities and weapons for these vehicles mix things up nicely. For all the improvements made to the visuals, gameplay, and design, the innovation that has had the biggest and longest lasting impact on the gaming industry is without question the Rumble feature.
This is the Rumble Pack. The big reason why Star Fox 64 is the coolest cinematic gaming experience there is. It's designed with a force feedback device that lets players feel the game.
Just like the Super Effects chip of the original game, Nintendo included a new hardware innovation in the Star Fox 64 box, the Rumble Pack, which allowed for a new kind of feedback for players. Not long after, Sony would release a DualShock controller, and in the next generation, the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube all featured built-in force feedback as part of the standard controller, which would become a mainstay in pretty much every controller since. The Rumble Pack provided a nice complement to the on-screen action in Star Fox 64. though what it represented for gaming as a whole was probably more significant than its implementation in this one game. At the time of its release, Star Fox 64 was the fastest selling game on the Nintendo 64 and received near universal critical acclaim. Of all the games in the series, Star Fox 64 is the one most fondly remembered by most people. The game even received a remake on 3DS almost 15 years later, which also did rather well. Even though the sting of Star Fox 2's cancellation was one that would remain for many, the extremely high quality of Star Fox 64 was almost enough for fans to forget. With great reviews, strong sales, and a very positive reception from fans, it seems Star Fox was set to become one of Nintendo's biggest franchises going forward, but the series would unfortunately never reach these heights again.
Don't ever give up, my son.
Father?
Follow me, Fox.
Despite anticipation for the next great Star Fox game, Fox McCloud would make only one more appearance on the Nintendo 64, but not in a way anyone was expecting. When the original Super Smash Bros. Was released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, no one could have predicted the phenomenon it would become. Among the initial roster of only 12 characters was Fox McCloud, and his accompanying stage, Sector Z. Even early on, Fox was among the strongest characters in the game with his quick speed, making him a favorite among the hardcore player base. Fox would become a staple of the franchise going forward, being featured in every game to date and announced to be returning in the upcoming 4th entry in the series. As the series expanded in the next installment, Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube, Falco joined the fray, and there were 2 new Star Fox stages. With Super Smash Bros. Brawl for the Wii, Wolf O'Donnell was added as the 3rd Star Fox character. While seeing Star Fox characters in Super Smash Bros. And its sequels was cool, it wasn't really a Star Fox game. After Star Fox 64, Super Smash Bros. Was Fox's last appearance on the N64, and Super Smash Bros. Melee was his first appearance on the GameCube. The first actual Star Fox game for the GameCube wasn't far off when Melee was released in late 2001, but once again, it wasn't exactly what we were expecting. Check back for Part 3 as the series goes in a bold and controversial new direction.